When people think of plants, a lot of times they think that orchids are hard to grow. I'd say in my 10 years of growing orchids, they're not hard, they're just a little bit different, and you have to think of them a little bit differently. Most folks are used to their standard house plants. Here's a philodendron that I have. It can literally grow in any kind of soil. I think it's in coconut peat, and it's doing just fine. Orchids are a little bit different. So orchids are epiphytes and they grow on trees. And whenever you're growing them indoors, we're trying to mimic the environment that they get in the wild. So we use lots of different kinds of materials to make sure we could mimic what these orchids get in the wild. And in today's video, I'm going to share the most common types of potting media and how they work and my experience with them in the last 10 years of growing. So before we jump into the different kinds of materials, some folks like to grow their orchids mounted. So they don't use any media, but they can water quite frequently, keep humidity up. I have one mounted orchid. I actually have some sphagnum moss in here to keep more moisture longer because my conditions are drier. But this is a way to grow orchids. You just have to keep up with the watering almost daily with a grow method like that. And the whole purpose of mounting an orchid is trying to mimic the environment that they have, but you have to keep up with the watering. So the first material, and I'd say that this is the most common kind of material, it's my preferred material to use when growing orchids, is bark. So instead of soil that you would use for a houseplant, houseplants tend to like moisture, they tend to really need a lot more. Orchids need moisture, but their roots need air. So whether you're mounting and you water frequently, let it dry, the roots are getting plenty of air. When you use bark, bark provides a similar environment to what they grow in the wild, except you're getting lots of air in there. This orchid here is potted in bark and sphagnum moss. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But bark is super common. So when using bark, there's different grades. There's fine, there's coarse. The finer it is, the more moisture it holds. The coarser it is, the less moisture it holds. Bark is typically used in different mixes. So I like to add sphagnum moss into mine so I could keep a little bit more moisture. But when you water, you want to water through and make sure the water is getting out, and then the bark will hold some moisture onto the roots. So the dryness, the rate of evaporation depends on how big the pot is. So there's different kinds of bark. There's fir bark, which is really common. There's pine bark, and there's orchiata bark. So I think you get what you pay for when it comes to bark. I've used Miracle-Gro mixes just fine. They're pretty cheap, but once in a while I get bags with just dust on the bottom, and those can break down a little faster. But generally with bark, it lasts between 3 and 5 years. Orchiata bark tends to last on the longer end of that. Bark eventually will break down. So you want to repot every few years because eventually it will degrade and turn to dust, and you don't want it to pack down and suffocate the roots. And that's the whole purpose of using bark, that it provides air to the roots. So you want to make sure that you repot before it breaks down. Bark is solid and very commonly used among orchid growers. Okay, the next material that you can use is coconut husk. And coconut husk is really cheap. During the pandemic, I was trying to get my hands on some sphagnum moss, and it was really expensive or sold out. I couldn't get my hands on it. So I started using coconut husk. And coconut husk is another commonly used material for orchids. Now, I find that different preparations of it can hold more moisture. So you can buy it, and then you have to soak it to make sure you get all the salts out and whatnot. But if you cut up the chunks a little bit, you keep chunks in there, those tend to hold moisture. If you shred it up, I find it holds a little bit less moisture, but it provides the same environment for the roots where it's pretty airy, yet it holds moisture. Coconut husk lasts about 3 years, I'd say, before it starts to break down. So it's another good option that lasts a long time. Over time, I've decided to move more towards bark just because I like how it works better in my environment, but there's lots of growers. Hillbilly Orchids is one that grows really well in coconut husk. Her orchids look amazing. It does provide a good environment for the roots, and the best part of it is that husk is really, really cheap. So if you're on a budget, give coconut husk a try. It's a viable growing method. It's a very commonly used material. And there are also mixes that use coconut husk chunks in them, and they work really well. Leca is another material that you can use to grow orchids. So leca will make sure that there's plenty of air between the roots, and it's impossible for leca to pack down. Leca is inorganic and it won't break down over time, and I find that leca does tend to dry out pretty fast. Now you can use leca in a semi-hydro system, so I have a lot of these orchids in semi-hydro. I'm starting to move these out of semi-hydro and into a bark setup, which I find works better in my environment. But you could use it as a system that wicks water from a reservoir and then provides an always moist system. Or you could just water regularly. It works well. If you can keep up with the watering for leca, I think it's great. I've seen some orchids in orchid shows just grown in leca and they're just watered regularly. It's inert media. It doesn't break down. You don't have to worry about repotting it super often, with the exception of if you have a very vigorous plant that shoots out lots of roots and they fill in all those air gaps in the leca, then you do need to create space for it because orchid roots need air. And if all those air gaps are gone, the roots will eventually suffocate. But that's only for really, really vigorous plants, I've noticed. Plants that are normal, average growth rate, you could just up pot them, usually no problem. Just pot them in another pot. But you want to watch out for anything that's taking over and has so many roots that the pot is basically, you can't squeeze it. It has no give. Just watch out for that, I'd say. Another material that's really common is Lavarock, and it's very similar to leca in that it's inorganic. It will not break down on you. I find that Lavarock may hold a little more moisture because it has more grooves inside of it. I find it very hard to repot because of those grooves, so whenever I'm repotting something with Lavarock, my fingers definitely feel it. Otherwise, it's another material that you can consider when thinking of something that you don't have to repot as often. It's natural. It's not going to break down on you. You could probably up pot it unless it's super, super vigorous and takes up every air gap in the pot. But that's another option that a lot of growers use. Personally, I don't like it as much because it dries out really fast in my environment, so I don't use it too much. Okay, another material, and this one is one of my favorite materials to use, is sphagnum moss. So sphagnum moss is a very moisture retentive material. I use it in my Phalaenopsis orchid, so a lot of these right here are fully sphagnum moss. I do top them with a little bit of bark, but it holds a lot of moisture. So a lot of folks like to use sphagnum moss with other mixes. So like in this case, most of my cattleyas are in bark and sphagnum moss, and they tend to do really well. So the bark creates a lot of air, and the sphagnum moss creates more, holds more moisture, so then I don't have to water as much. So a lot of plants in here, I don't have to water them more than every 5 days, every week. I try not to water on a schedule because everything dries at a different rate, so I just look at them and see what needs it a little bit more. But sphagnum moss can be used either on its own or in mixes, most commonly in mixes. And the downside for sphagnum moss, I'd say, is that it's really expensive, especially the high quality sphagnum moss. So with sphagnum moss, it holds a lot of moisture, which is amazing. There are different grades of sphagnum moss. I love New Zealand sphagnum moss, and that tends to last a pretty long time. Sphagnum moss does break down, though, faster than other materials. So poor quality sphagnum moss can start breaking down in about a year. High quality sphagnum moss, about 2 years. I've gone 3-4 years with some of my plants in sphagnum moss, especially if it's just an amendment. But if your entire plant is in sphagnum moss, you want to watch out for it breaking down. You can pot your orchids in sphagnum moss, provided you keep it fluffy, but over time it does tend to pack down as you're watering it. So I wouldn't keep an orchid in sphagnum moss for more than 2 years. If it's in a pot under, say, 5 inches, then I'd pot it in moss. But if it's in a bigger pot, I would add other things like bark, because you want to make sure it stays airy, because as you're watering it, it will start coming in. Otherwise, sphagnum moss is amazing. It's great for your mixes if you want to hold more moisture. And what you're using is really going to be dependent on how available you are to water. So if you like to water your plants every day, you can get away with mounting your orchids, right? If you are like me, you have a big collection, you're not really watering that much, then maybe you want to use a little bit more sphagnum moss. Maybe you want like an always moist system like semi-hydro. I'm moving away from that system, but the reason for it was because I didn't want to water my collection that often. So everything works differently for everyone. It takes a lot of trial and error to see what works in your environment. What works for me may not work for you, and what works for you may not work for me. Coconut husk for some folks works really, really well. Lavarock works really well for some folks, and for me, it's just I don't do well with it because I just can't water as often as I should with Lavarock. There are other materials out there such as tree fern. I'm not too familiar with that, but it's the same concept. It has a lot of air, so whenever you pot your orchids in it, it can hold moisture yet give the air that's required. I don't have too much experience with that. There's perlite as well. It's used as an amendment for orchid mixes that adds drainage. So whenever you're watering your orchid, you want there to be air, but you also don't want it to be sitting in water. So perlite, sometimes pumice, is added as an amendment to make sure things are draining through the pot, keeping it nice and airy. So say you have a mix of bark, sphagnum moss, perlite. Bark provides air, sphagnum moss is going to provide moisture, and then perlite's going to add even more drainage to that mix. So it's great. So you could water it abundantly over your sink, let it drain. Nice hydration, and the orchid's going to be really happy. So orchids are a little bit different, but I'd say they're not hard once you get the potting media right. So the biggest difference between houseplants and orchids is that the roots of orchids need more air. So that's why we use different materials. Once you have the right materials, you're going to find that growing orchids is going to be so much easier once you get the watering right. But I'll say it again, orchids are not hard, they're just different, and once you have that right, you're going to be golden. So in the next video, I'm going to share different pots that you can use to grow your orchids. There's a million different ways you can go about this, and it's just about finding what works for you. So lots of trial and error. Let me know down below what your material of choice is. This is not an exhaustive list. Different kinds of materials are available in different places in the world. Let me know down below what you use, and I will see you in the next video. Bye, everyone.